Brad, I don't have any tattoos.
No.
I know it's shocking.
I am just flabbergasted, flummoxed. You don't seem like much of a tattoo kind of guy, but go on.
Well, like I'm into the idea conceptually, but I've never really liked anything long enough to feel like I can commit to it for that kind of length of time.
That is obstacle number one, is not being able to decide what I want on my body for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Like I've never, like, I like my kid, but it's weird. I'm not gonna put her face on my back. Anyway, the point is, I'm looking at our show notes, our show art for the last couple of weeks, and I think I see something that I like enough maybe to put on my body for all eternity.
Hang on, I have to guess now. Are we talking tech or FOSS?
FOSS. This is a FOSS.
Oh, not tech. Is it the Blender logo?
No, it is not the Blender logo.
Is it the cute little octopus of OctoPrint?
It is not the cute little octopus. It is a good octopus, though, but it is not the OctoPrint octopus.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, hi.
Is it the curl logo?
Nope, not the curl logo.
Huh. Okay, well, there's only so many options here.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm guessing it's not this picture of a GitHub repo.
No.
Really running out of logo. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Hang on. Okay, if this is it.
Yeah.
Mad respect.
Hello, hi.
Is it the Windows 95 network neighborhood icon?
I'm looking at it, I'm like, I deeply identify with that Windows 95 network neighborhood icon.
That's okay. Look,
it speaks to me because you know what? It's all about connection, Brad.
It's true. So you're not wrong. I mean, these two computers are connected by a right-angled pipe of some kind. I mean, it's like they're right there.
One has a green screen. One has a blue screen. It's the metaphor for Windows.
Is that the metaphor for iMessage versus SMS?
That's where it all started. Well, except for blue is iMessage and right. Yeah.
Green is SMS.
Green is for bad people. I mean, Android people, whatever.
I picked the show art for all these episodes, and normally I just put the logo of the project for the FOSS pod. But
yeah,
the Samba logo was not of such proportions that would fit into Simplecast's kind of, I guess that's a 1:1 frame.
So, well, it's more pixels than that, but it's a 1:1 ratio. Yeah.
1:1 ratio is what I mean. Yeah.
You can go up to you can put 512 pixels in there if you want. You can put 3 pixels in. They don't care.
Yes. The Samba logo is extremely wide and extremely not tall, so it doesn't fit into a square well. And then I was like, you know what is vaguely square shaped is the icon set from Windows 95.
Home of SMB. That was like SMB 2, right? Or 1 point something. Really? I can't remember.
So were you working with SMB at that time?
No, I was in college then.
Okay.
I mean, I was, but I didn't know anything about it. I knew enough. Like that was back in the time when I knew enough to make a network work. And that was pretty much it. Didn't know how. I didn't understand TCPs or IPs. I vaguely understood that you had to get an IP address from somewhere if you wanted to share internet. But beyond that, all bets were off.
Point-to-point protocol is just about the only protocol I was aware of at that time.
We were just slipping back then, man.
Yes. We arguably are still slipping.
Welcome to Brad Will Make a Tech FOSS Pod. I'm Will.
I'm the open source Brad. That doesn't make any sense. Hello.
Hi. Hello. We're doing something a little bit different this week. It's been a minute since we launched this new podcast in the dawn of 2022. Now we're coming into 2022's late middle age.
Dude, I was at Costco earlier.
Uh-huh. Speaking of late middle age,
the holiday decks are out.
What?
The holiday decks, the decorations, the Christmas trees.
Wait, Christmas stuff is out? It's not even Halloween yet.
It is quite literally still September, and Christmas trees with active lit up Christmas lights were out. Holiday blend coffee was around and for sale.
Fudge. Have I missed the pumpkin spice window already?
Oh, I saw a new affront to nature in the pumpkin spice category. It was like it was pumpkin spice something that should not have been, and I can't remember what it was.
What wouldn't benefit from being pumpkin spice? Like deodorant, not good pumpkin spiced, I'm gonna say.
I think it was a pumpkin spice dipping sauce right in the middle between like the hummus and the artichoke dip and stuff. There was a pumpkin spice.
It's like pumpkin spice flavored goo.
Yes.
I don't know about that one.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan of the pumpkin spice. I like a pumpkin pie, which has pumpkin spice.
Oh, you're pumpkin pie. Like, I didn't think I was a fan of pumpkin pie until I had yours and Gina's pumpkin pie. And then I was like, whoa.
Wait, what's this and Gina's crap? I make that one by hand.
Wait, really?
Yeah, that's all me.
Entire thing?
Uh-huh. From scratch, usually.
Okay. Well, then your single-handed pumpkin pie is pretty damn good.
Look, she makes a lot of the other stuff, but the pies belong to me. I'm not a huge fan of the pumpkin spice latte. I've tried it. I've been there. I've tasted the forbidden fruit and I was like, oh, this is okay. Too sweet for me.
You mean the forbidden gourd?
Yeah. Yes, the forbidden gourd. I do really, 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 really like a peppermint mocha though. I'll go in for a peppermint mocha. That's some chocolatey coffee pepperminty business I can get behind. But this week, instead of doing a new tech pod, we wanted to highlight a recent okay, first off, the FOSS pod since the initial launch, you always find your legs with a new podcast. It's changed a little bit. It's gotten a little bit more interviewee of late. Mm-hmm. And we've done interviews with a ton of incredible guests who run projects and work on projects ranging from Wikipedia and Home Assistant to curl. We've talked to people who've written code that runs on Mars.
We have.
That's a trip. We talked to the student insurrectionists, one of the student insurrectionists who founded VLC and works on VLC, Jean-Baptiste.
VLC episode, pretty great.
Audio quality, not great. Content, 10 out of 10, I'm going to say.
He had a lot of very interesting and opinionated things to say.
The number of fucks he gave was 0.
Special life goal achieved. We talked to Foon.
We did talk to Foon about 3D Movie Maker.
Yeah, Twitter's own Foon.
Yeah.
One of the best follows on Twitter.
I mean, consistently I don't know what, Foon just every once in a while you'll just open up Twitter and you'll be like, oh, Foon's taking something apart again. And yesterday it was a keyboard that it had Cherry MX keycaps on it. But then when they took the caps off and looked at what was underneath, it was just like a membrane key. So the MX keycaps were just into a plunger that smashed the membrane keyboard. I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah, there's like a data forensics are happening again. They did like a 40 megabyte hard drive from the late 80s one time.
Yeah.
Which, first of all, took all kinds of bizarre partitioning and file system utilities to even access.
I'm sure.
But then they found intact emails on there from whatever business was using that hard drive in the late 80s.
Who was using email in the late? That's amazing.
It was,
probably like IBM or somebody. 40 meg hard drive was pretty big back then.
I'm kind of fudging dates and sizes a little bit, but you get the gist. It was something like that. Anyway.
Yeah. We talked to Foon. We talked to Paula Schautzen from Home Assistant. We talked to Daniel Stenberg from Curl. We've talked to, like we said, Jean-Baptiste. We talked to the two of the folks who work on Blender.
Yeah, Delay and Pablo from those guys were great.
That was fantastic.
Really interesting conversation on Blender.
And then the most recent episode, we have Jeremy Allison, who is one of the co-creators and current maintainers of the Samba project, which it's so we've had this interesting spectrum of people who are kind of have established wildly popular, like best in class kind of applications like Jim Bailey from OBS and, Jean-Baptiste from VLC and stuff like that. We talked to people who do plumbing on the internet, like Daniel Stenberg at Curl and Jeremy at Samba.
Yes.
This episode that we're running here today is one of my absolute favorites because it's a project that's a little bit newer. It's a project that's kind of grown with the ecosystem that it supports. And it's Gina from OctoPrint.
Yes.
Came in and sat down with us and we talked about kind of how that project got started, how it where it is now, what like the future of it holds. Because 3D printing, she started that in 2011 or 2012 when 3D printing was consumer 3D printing was brand new. And with OctoPrint, if you don't know, is a print server for 3D printers. So normally when you run a 3D printer, we talk about it in the episode, and I'm not going to reiterate here, but it served a really important purpose. I used it back in the early days before we really even had, I ran it on a computer, not even a Raspberry Pi back then. It was hugely important for me with the 3D mystery object and for other stuff we were printing around the office. Yeah. And her project is at a different place. She's at the point now where it's getting too big for her to do everything herself. And she's having to rework the project so that other people can contribute to it meaningfully. And it's a really interesting contrast to some of the other folks we've talked to along the way.
It seems like she's at the inflection point where she is going from just developer to now developer and maintainer. Or I mean, I guess you're always a maintainer even when you're the sole developer, but I guess the air traffic control aspect of being a maintainer is going to come to the fore as soon as she starts taking contributions from other developers.
Yeah, she said she paused. We talk about this a lot in the episode, but she talks about literally pausing new work in order to like do documentation and stuff that will let other people help her accelerate the project. And it's interesting because as a contrast to Home Assistant, where we talked to Paulus, like he went through that. He's been like this seems like the fire and flame that open source projects that get past a certain level of success and popularity kind of have to get through, especially when they support broad hardware ecosystems, as both of those projects do. So
also just real quick, I mean, you'll hear more about this, but just to pique people's interests or maybe wet their whistles a little bit. Like I learned a lot about just 3D printing, what the 3D printing stack entails and the ups and downs of that process. And like, there's a lot of neat stuff that OctoPrint does besides what you might imagine. Like you can, let's say you want to put your 3D printer out in the garage so you don't have to breathe fumes, and you can like hook a webcam into it and use that to observe your print remotely. In addition to doing the kind of microcontroller-y aspects of running the print. Anyway, there's a lot of interesting info in the, even if you don't know anything about 3D printing or think you care about it, there's actually a lot to learn in this episode.
For the 3D printing expert and the 3D printing curious is what I would say. You can even do machine learning on those videos so that you see if like the print's going bad. It's really cool.
Oh, wow.
They do vision. There's plugins that do visual, like machine visual recognition of spaghettification. It's really neat. It's a neat project.
Are you ever afraid of technology? You ever like occasionally, does that just mean I'm getting old? Like occasionally my like fascination and awe give way to terror briefly when I hear things like that.
What's the rule? Anything that existed before you were 7 has always existed. Anything that's invented between the time you're 7 and 35 is exciting and cool. And anything that's invented after you're 35 is terrifying.
Ooh, I don't like where this is going.
Yeah, I got bad news for you, Brad. Yeah, but anyway, our talk with Gina is great. You should give the episode a listen. If you enjoy it, please go over to fosspod.content.town and mash that subscribe button, add it to your feed reader, or you can find us in all the listings now as well. You have a nice backlog of excellent episodes to listen to. There'll be more coming in not too distant future. We also would love it if anybody who likes the show would go over to iTunes and mash the review button. It's still like going there and putting a star rating on the episode is still one of the best ways to help podcast get distribution. Whether it's our show or anybody else's, like leaving reviews on iTunes for your favorite podcast, even if you don't listen to them on iTunes or with the Apple Podcast app or whatever, really helpful for podcasters.
And iTunes reviews invented before I turned 35. So pretty awesome. Please participate.
And that's it. I think that, we're doing it. We want to do a question and answer episode.
Yeah, we're toying with the idea, at least, of doing like a Q&A type episode on the FOSS-pod. So with fosspod@content.town.
That is an email address that you can send a question to, and we will answer. We will hopefully turn it into an A. We're specifically looking for questions that we need to go out and get people to answer, because we have this large network of folks who've been on the show and we're talking to about future episodes and stuff like that. And we want to loop them in and maybe get some like live answers from experts on their projects about stuff. So yeah, we're going to abuse our network basically to do a Q&A episode that's going to take like 10 times the effort of a normal Q&A of a normal episode of the podcast probably. But here we go.
It's certainly true. Even people we haven't had on previously, if you've got people in the wider open source world that you would like to put a Q to, we can do our best. We've got some connections.
We will make an effort to turn it into an A. No promises, but we'll see what we can do. Again, the email address is
fosspod@content.town.
Fosspod@content.town. Very good. It's a good email address. So I guess without further ado, 17 minutes into this recording, let's throw it over to Past Us, who interviewed Gina from OctoPrint. Hey, Brad, do you remember the first time I came down into the basement at Giant Bomb in Sausalito and showed you a 3D printed ring that looked vaguely like a deer, and you all were kind of professionally disinterested in it?
No, that was the finest 3D print I had ever seen to date at the time.
That was the only 3D print you'd ever seen at the time, though, correct?
Completely professional, high quality product that you turned out there. I mean, look, that was early days for 3D printing, and like, even in the best of circumstances, making kind of warmed over plastic behave itself not the smallest feat, right?
Yeah, it was okay. So yeah, the ring was a vaguely ring-shaped thing made of goopy plastic, and the MakerBot cupcake that Norm and I built in the old Whiskey Media offices in 2010 was early, to say the least. Like it was a finicky machine that was hard to keep running and hard to get good results out of. But occasionally, you could do something that was kind of magical. And in the preceding 12 years, 13 years, the technology has improved dramatically, both in terms of the printers, the kits and the motors that are available to drive the printers, the electronics that drive the printers are more powerful. And the results that you get out of even a really inexpensive 3D printer right now are like far and away better than anything we ever got out of our old cupcake or even the subsequent printers we use for the next couple of years.
Sure. But Will, there are so many printers on the market now. What if there were, let's say, like a Home Assistant, but for 3D printers, where you had one interface that could talk to all of them and make everything work under a kind of common scheme?
Oh, you mean something like a print server for 3D printers?
Sure, something like that. If only we could do an episode about something like that.
If only. Welcome to the FOSS Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
Brad, this week I am very, very excited to introduce our guest. We, on the show this week, have Gina Häußge of the OctoPrint project, which is, it's a print server for 3D printers.
Dude, 3D printing very close to your heart. Not something I have ever dabbled with. Like, I just am an outsider looking in, but like, A, this was a fascinating conversation. Like, she was so interesting to listen to. But B, I have no idea how, let's say, ramshackle the 3D printing process is without something like OctoPrint.
Well, okay, I wouldn't say it's ramshackle. The process is pretty straightforward, right? You take a 3D model that's an STL or an OBJ or some relatively standard file format that describes a 3D shape in space, right? And then you use a tool called a slicer, and you position that shape on the print bed, and the slicer looks at it and says, okay, we're going to cut it up into this many layers because this is the vertical resolution of the printer, how thick the layers that the printer prints are. And you orient it on the bed so that you get the best results for what you want, whether you want like a flat bottom or whatever. There's a bunch of nuance to that. But this is all stuff that people have to do. And then that slicer turns that 3D model into a series of layers, and the layers are represented by the movements of the print head or the movements of whatever the mechanism is that generates the material for each layer. And then it goes up a layer, and then it does the same thing again. And eventually you have this stack of slices that becomes a 3D object. Now, the tricky part is that the slicer generates this stuff called G-code, which is basically software that describes how the print head moves. It literally is like go from X00 to X117, X7Y4, and move the motor that extrudes the plastic this speed during that entire movement, stuff like that. And that G-code is both printer specific and is incredibly important to getting a high quality print out of your printer. So if your slicer does a bad job, you're not going to have a good print. There's nothing you can do about it at that point.
Right. That's an example of the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Like, for example, what you just said, the fact that G-code is unique to kind of the maker of the 3D printer, right? Like, it's not a universal language. And another fact that came out of this conversation that blew my mind, and OctoPrint helps with stuff like this, is that it's not like you are loading that entire design onto onboard memory on the 3D printer and just pressing a button and walking away. Like, you had to maintain a steady flow of information to the printer from like whatever PC you were feeding it from. And like, that's a place where OctoPrint helps smooth the process. We'll get into that.
Well, yeah. So these days, most printers do have onboard memory and let you load it directly onto the board.
Okay.
There are benefits to doing it with a host-based connection, which is what it's, what usually in the old days, in 2010, when we were printing in the tested office, we would plug the cupcake with a USB port that had a serial connection over that USB port to a host machine, and the G-code would be fed from a machine, a piece of software running on that computer over. Now, if like the CPU usage spiked or the computer froze for a second or two, it would jack up your print because everything would get out of whack, basically, which
blows my mind. Like, why would anybody want to deal with that?
Well, yeah.
And now they don't have to.
And the prints were, 12, 13, 14 hours sometimes for a big one. So like the cost of failure there is really, really high in terms of time because you get like 1 or 2 shots a day on a big, highly complex print. The other thing was there was no way to monitor it. So these prints take a long time. You don't necessarily want to have the thing that's spitting out the ABS plastic sitting in your workspace with you where you can look at it because it smells bad and it'll give you a headache. And it's probably not super healthy over the long term. So, but also you don't want to leave this thing that has a 200 degrees Celsius hot end spewing plastic out unsupervised because it's kind of a fire hazard. Not like a bad fire hazard, but it's like just often enough that you want to keep an eye on it. So OctoPrint does both of those things. It feeds the G code to the printers. It lets you hook up cameras and things like that to the device so you can kind of track what's going on. And it does all sorts of other fancy stuff. Like there's all like cool machine learning visual. We'll talk about with Gina in a minute.
Yeah. It sounds like it does quite a bit more than just that basic stuff. But yeah, why don't we let Gina tell us all about it?
This week's FOSS is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. You can find out more about Google Open Source at opensource.google. I'm curious how you got started with OctoPrint. Like, were you working with 3D printing for work or for fun, and you had a problem to solve? Like, what was your path to thinking, I need to make a print server for 3D printers?
Yeah, so first of all, maybe I should start how I even got into 3D printing in the first place. And it so happened that I was at this hacker conference, Hacking at Random, in 2009 in the Netherlands. And in one tent, or maybe it was also a brick building, I can't remember, they had set up some of these new 3D printers. So the patents had just expired a couple of years prior, or maybe even 1 year prior. I can't remember right now the exact timeline. And suddenly there were these things now for me to look at and be mesmerized by, like pieces of plastic just happening out of thin air into existence, a bit like replicators from Star Trek or something like that. And that was kind of when I figured, okay, this is a very fascinating technology, but I did not have space for something like that at that time. So, and then suddenly nerdy friends of mine started to acquire 3D printers left and right. And we are now in something like 2010, 2011. And then in 2012, I moved into a bigger apartment, which I'm also actually still in. And suddenly I found myself in the possession of space to acquire a 3D printer. So after some back and forth and research and all that, I bought myself a 3D printer, set it up here in my office, put it next to my PC. And back then, these things were really, really dumb. So they did not have the capability of running a print shop themselves, but you had to tether them to your computer or to your laptop or whatnot, and then spool and stream the full job to them over the duration of the job. So if your PC decided to do an upgrade in the meantime, your print was broken. If you wanted to play a game, which I'm also a gamer, which is something that I tend to do in my free time when I'm sitting in front of my desk, then you were running the risk of interrupting your print by slowdowns or something like that. So that was a bit suboptimal. And also there is the addition of printers produce noise, produce fumes, and this thing was sitting next to me for hours on end, so that was a bit annoying. And I figured, okay, this year in 2012, the Raspberry Pi had just been released, which was this little, or is this little, about 35, 40-ish bucks kind of single PCB computer. And I figured, well, I'm sure there is some software out of there that I can just throw on that thing and then put a Wi-Fi dongle on it. The Raspberry Pi back then did not even have Wi-Fi on board yet. Throw that in my spare bathroom, monitor it from my phone or something like that. And then I know what is going on, but I do not have to sit next to it. And also it does not take up my PC and also not the whole office, basically. And so I got myself a Raspberry Pi, and then I looked for software that would do what I wanted, and I couldn't find any. So there were some, I think 2 or 3 packages that basically treated the printer like a black box, like shooting it code and hoping it would do the right thing, but no kind of feedback loop. And that was something that really was not something that I wanted, because printers back then were even less reliable than they are these days. So you really wanted to keep an eye on it, especially during the crucial first half an hour or something like that, to make sure that bed adhesion was working and that temperatures kept up and stuff like that. And so I figured, okay, there is nothing like that. Maybe I should just sit down and build. So maybe some words on my background. I've always been a nerd. I learned coding at the age of 7. I got into computer science at university, and I later turned software engineer / technical architect stuff. So that was my background back there. Being like a corporate drone during the day, and then at night tinkering with pet projects, because coding to this day is still like my major passion.
How did you get started coding at like 7? Seems early.
Especially in the 80s, right?
So.
That was when my parents got the first computer back then from my uncle, actually, an old Apple IIe that he no longer needed, it had this green shaded monitor, and it came with 2 5.25-inch floppy drives, and that was it. And naturally, me as a 6 or 7-year-old, seeing that thing, I was all about gaming and playing games with it. And my dad, on the other hand, however, he took me to the side and was like, no, this is a working machine. This is a tool. This is not a toy, but I can show you something. And then he showed me the first couple of lines of BASIC, and I wrote my first code. And then we went into this a bit as a daddy-daughter kind of thing. And my mom also chimed in here and there and also coded some stuff up. So it was a bit of a family thing at first. But it kind of totally clicked with me because I also still love, and back then already loved playing with Lego and building stuff with Lego. And to me, coding still to this day just feels like building stuff out of Lego, but the bricks never run out. And if I'm missing a certain kind of brick, I can just build it.
I never thought about it like that before, but it makes a ton of sense.
What kind of coding work were you doing as you put it, as a corporate drone before you started working on OctoPrint full time? Were you doing coding that already worked with hardware in your day job at that time, or?
No, less. I mean, yeah, in a way, every kind of code works with hardware, right? But sure. I was mostly, working as a consultant, doing custom solution development for various clients with a bit of a focus on IPTV stuff like coding, recording backends, and set-top box front ends and stuff like this in various languages, primarily Java though. So building OctoPrint in Python was a bit of a diversion from my usual kind of thing as well. I had been a system administrator during my university days, and so got familiar with Python during that time because, for automation or something like that, it's just beautiful. And then when I sat down during my Christmas break of 2012 and was wondering, so how do I get this, what I'm envisioning here, this remote control / baby monitor thingy for my 3D printer now somehow built in a way that it will actually be done within like 1 or 2 weeks. Yeah, the word done is a bit ironic given that we're now almost 10 years later and I'm still working on it, but so that it's usable, let's call it like that. And I fell over what is still available, by the way, which is the Cura slicer. And the Cura slicer back then, and I think also still, had the ability to also connect to a printer and talk to a printer and stream stuff to a printer. And so I took this part, and Cura is written in Python, so I took this part and built up all around it. In the beginning, I had absolutely no idea how to communicate with a printer. I figured, it's a serial interface. It can't be so difficult. And it turns out that this is one of the most stressful and complicated parts of my whole job now. Because, we don't really have a proper, well-defined standard there. So every printer vendor and every firmware vendor does things slightly differently, which makes it an absolute nightmare to interface with. But back then I was naive and optimistic and just took this basic COM layer from Cura and built my web interface in Flask on top of it. And within, I think I sat down on it on sometime around December 20th or 23rd. And by 25th, it was already printing and giving me feedback. And then I also added a webcam feed. And by the end of my vacation, come January, I figured, okay, it's doing everything that I wanted it to. I'm just going to throw it up now on GitHub or something like that. And post some stuff publicly about it on Google Plus. Back then was still my hood, so to speak, and then I'll return to my normal life. And then suddenly emails started pouring in from all over the world, and tickets started showing up in my GitHub issue tracker where people were like, hey, I've been meaning to have something like this for ages, or that's beautiful. I never thought I needed this, but now I can't live without it anymore. Things like that. And it started growing and growing and growing. And by mid of 2013, I actually talked to my boss about reducing my job to 4 days a week so that I could have 1 week dedicated to OctoPrint, obviously out of my own pocket. And then by early 2014, I had to realize that this 1 day per week was not even remotely doing it justice anymore either, because the user base was just growing and growing and growing. And at that time, I was approached by a Spanish technology company who was also building 3D printers. And they said, hey, we want to invite you to Madrid. And then they flew me in and then we talked. And it turned out that they really enjoyed my work on OctoPrint and just wanted me to be able to do it full time.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah, that was nice because it also came with an absolutely perfect timing, because I was really starting to wonder how to juggle both of these responsibilities in my life, the paying job and the bill paying job, and this creation of mine that I felt was gaining a lot of traction and that I was really not doing it justice due to a lack of time.
Had you done open source work before this, or was this the first open source project you contributed to?
Nah, I did some, yeah. So actually, I did open source before I knew what open source was. So back then, the stuff that I published very, very early in the very early 2000s, I just threw that up for people to use. I didn't know what open source licenses were or something like this, but that is how I started. And then I was a contributor to the DokuWiki project for a while, and the maintainer, Andreas Gore, is still also a close personal friend of mine. So I already made friendships through open source before I had my own big project going. So that's kind of nice.
So I installed OctoPrint because I desperately needed to have a 3D printer. I didn't want to spend my own money on one. So I justified it by telling the people that owned the site that I was working on at the time that we would just do a weekly print and make a time-lapse video that we put on YouTube, and people would love that. And it turns out two of those things were true. And in 2010, when we built the cupcake, getting a 3D printer to work reliably once a week turned out to be a pretty substantial challenge.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But by the time you came around with OctoPrint, I think we were on a MakerBot or a Replicator or something like that, and eventually moved to printerbots, and the market for printers exploded right around the time that you kicked off with OctoPrint. How much has that explosion of that 3D printer market, like just the sheer volume of 3D printers, been both important to you? And also, I have to imagine it's an absolute nightmare supporting a million different printers.
It is, yeah, it absolutely is. And yeah, so this explosion kind of coincided with my move towards first being full-time working on OctoPrint, but still employed. And then later, when this company that I mentioned ran out of money for endeavors like that, also, yeah, this boom and this enormous amount of people out there now with printers allowed me to say, okay, I'm going to risk this. I'm going to try if I can do this through crowdfunding back in 2016. And that has been working well since then. So, I mean, in the beginning, we only had a very, very small number of companies producing printers commercially. And usually it was a case of find someone with a printer and have them print some parts for you. The vitamins you add yourself, with the vitamins being stuff like screws and linear rails and whatnot. And then you build that, and hopefully at some point it would actually work, and sometimes it didn't. And then people like MakerBot and Ultimaker and later also PrinterBot and stuff came on the scene and made this a bit more accessible for the masses. And that was also when I jumped in. And then after that, then came China, right? And that was really when the whole boom happened, when we got these cheap printers where it was pretty much a race to the bottom, sadly, not only in price, but also in quality. So there have been some safety hazards over the years, and also some absolutely horrible things in firmware that I had to work around. And so that has been a bit of a gift and a curse at the same time. On the one hand, it made the whole technology really accessible for a lot of people who have done really, really awesome things with it. On the other hand, it has made the whole landscape so very much fragmented, and with a multitude of electronics that I can encounter with OctoPrint, with a multitude of firmware that I can encounter with OctoPrint, that writing code to interface with all the 3D printers under the sun out there is really, really challenging. And I had absolutely not anticipated how much work that would be. I thought the biggest challenge would be the web interface and the API and designing that stuff so that people would actually want to use it. And I mean, that is also a big challenge. And now I also have the plugin system that I have to think about and things like that. But whenever I need to do something in the communication layer, let's just say the gray in my hair has really increased over the past 10 years. And I think at least some of that is due to OctoPrint.
How many actual platforms would you say there are that you have to support? You know, like in the smart home space, for example, you know, there will be like smart plugs from a zillion different vendors, but then you look and see that like, 90% of these are all using the same controller chip. So that's actually just one interface. Is there a similar situation in 3D printers where a lot of the like rebadged models are all actually using the same controller hardware?
Yeah, so thankfully we have a bunch of, let's say, firmware families. So on one hand, there is Marlin, which is still, I think, the biggest player. I have some stats up on stats.octoprint.org that people can look at if they are interested in what firmwares are used. But there is Marlin. Then there is various forks of that also that have slight different implementations here and there. Then Repetier firmware is also something that is still present. We have Clipper. We used to have something called, how was it called? Redeem, maybe? Not sure right now. And some other stuff, some self-cooked things that I like to just call. Yeah, it's tricky for some of the things to give them a name even, because if the firmware doesn't identify itself with some name, then you have to give it some name. So one firmware out there I just call CBD made it, because that is what the firmware prints out when you run it. But yeah, no idea who actually made it. It just ships with some Chinese printers and has some very, very interesting interpretations of the communication protocol, which require an OctoPrint plugin to fix, or rather to standardize and to make usable again.
You had mentioned that some of the firmware is shipped with things that were shocking to you. Like what kind of a 3D printer is an inherently semi-dangerous thing. Mm-hmm. It has a hot end that gets 200 Celsius, and it runs something that'll catch on fire if you leave it in there long enough through that end. But what do you find that's dangerous?
So one of the things that OctoPrint actually started warning people about after one too many posts on Reddit about actually burnt down printers was that some vendors ship their printers with the so-called thermal runaway protection disabled. And that is simply a feature in firmware that will look at how much power is it currently putting into the heater and what kind of temperature difference is it measuring with the thermistor that is in the hot end. And if it sees that one thing is rising but the other isn't, then there is some kind of disconnect. So either the heater cartridge is stuck in on position or something like that, or the thermistor fell out of the hot end, which, yes, is something that can happen, especially in, let's say, sub-quality components or subpar quality components. And the problem with this is if you buy cheap thermistors and cheap hardware in general, that sometimes this hardware and these thermistors and also your controllers and whatnot can be a bit flaky. And this flakiness then will lead to false positives of this thermal runaway protection. So some vendors are going the route of, instead of fixing the components, they're simply disabling the watchdog. And then if something breaks, you might suddenly have a hot end that is not sitting at 200 degrees, but at 600 degrees. And the PTFE tube inside is now releasing some chlorine compounds or something like that. So a burning printer is not necessarily the worst thing that can happen with you to you in this case, or the only thing that can happen to you. And so I started identifying firmware also for this reason, to just be able to tell people, hey, the firmware you're running there, that has this very, very, very bad flaw, and you really need to get this fixed. Flash different firmware or read up here on how to configure it properly, stuff like that.
It's interesting because the more I spent 3D printing, the less I wanted to sit next to a 3D printer all day while it was running. Mm-hmm. I don't know that people necessarily understand, 3D prints, especially FDM, the fused deposition where you spit the plastic out. It's often a really lengthy, time-consuming process. A short print can be a couple of hours and a long one can be several days.
Yeah.
How long was it before you got OctoPrint to a point, especially with those early Pis, that it was able to handle a really long, huge project on one of the bigger printers? How do you optimize that versus like the person who has like a $400 home, what somebody who's a professional? Because I know both professionals and enthusiasts who use OctoPrint, and it's a very different market and very different like failure
tolerance.
Yeah, exactly, failure tolerance.
Yeah. So funnily enough, I rarely had any kind of stability issues from the get-go. So it was not me who did the first multiple day print on OctoPrint, but it was actually someone that I knew from Google Plus who messaged me and, hey, by the way, this Taj Mahal print here that went on for 28 hours or something flawlessly via OctoPrint. Thank you again. And it was like, okay, cool. Apparently this works. I mean, the thing is, if you figure out how to reliably communicate with the printer, whether you do it for 1 hour or for 200 of them is not necessarily the problem. The bigger problem here is instead actually stuff like, will the print actually stick to the bed long enough? Will the filament tangle? Will horrible things happen due to a cat in the room? You don't know about all of that. So the idea behind OctoPrint really in that point was you cannot... I mean, okay, I have to add a caveat here. Obviously, OctoPrint will tell you when you set it up for the very first time that you should never leave your print unattended and that you should make sure that at any point in time when something goes wrong, a human can intervene and prevent a fire or prevent whatever. Still, I'm leaving my prints unattended myself because I trust my printer. I know that my printer is electronically sound. And the worst thing that can happen actually just happened this morning when I woke up to a whole print bed full of maybe 5 hours of extruded filament completely not attached to anything. So what we call spaghetti. So spaghetti for breakfast is the stuff that still can happen. Although there are actually OctoPrint plugins that can help you with that through machine learning and picture analysis from the webcam and then tell apart a working print from a spaghetti print and then stop the print job for you. I did not have anything like that installed. But yeah, so in general, from my personal experience, the bigger issue is really with the reliability of the printer from a mechanical perspective or from the filament from a mechanical perspective. And the software so far has rarely been the issue. I am very happy about that, and I knock on wood that it stays this way. But yeah, some issues that we had actually was where so most common thing that you install OctoPrint on is a Raspberry Pi, and that is what I was originally writing it for, but it runs on everything. The problem is with Raspberry Pis, they are a bit, how do I say, choosy when it comes to the power supply that they accept as adequate. And a lot of people are seeing the micro USB input, or these days the USB-C input on the Raspberry Pi and think, oh, I still have a phone charger lying around here somewhere, and use that to power that thing, with the result that it is browning out left and right and causing all kind of weird things. And there was a time when I was constantly getting reports like OctoPrint suddenly stopped my print at I don't know, 5 a.m. in the morning or something like that. And it was one of these issues where it's absolutely impossible to reproduce, where it's absolutely impossible to debug. But at some point I got the idea that might be a good idea to just monitor whether the Pi was getting enough power. And then it turned out that a lot, maybe even most of these issues that I observed over the years was down to the Pi browning out, losing the serial connection to the printer, losing network connection, losing whatnot, losing its marbles and deciding to just send half the lines over, stuff like that. And ever since OctoPrint is warning people about these undervoltage situations, it has caused a number of tickets due to these made go down significantly. On the other hand, it has opened me up to a lot of angry users who feel like I'm overstepping my boundaries by telling them that their power supplies are inadequate. And that it is perfectly fine because it says 3 amps on it, and there cannot be a browning out issue, and it must be my code that is at fault, at which point I then usually point them to the fact that I'm actually just using the Raspberry Pi's own code, and that if says it is browning out, then it is browning out, regardless of whether that is correct or not. And then I cannot help them, and they need to fix their power supply. But yeah, that is an ongoing battle still.
Do you have any contact with the Raspberry Pi Foundation at all? Have you ever spoken to them about stuff like this? Like I've bought endless pies over time, and I'm a little surprised that they don't more aggressively push that issue on people. You know, they're very like politely like, we like our official power supply. Like you should look for one that does this, but it's not. They're maybe not as forceful about hammering that requirement home as they could be.
I mean, they built in the way, at least, that you can detect it. And also, if you run their UI, if you boot that thing, not headless like I usually boot it, but actually with a monitor and stuff attached, you will see a little warning thingy pop up in the upper right corner, I think, if you have undervoltage. So they are aware of the problem, I think, but for some reason, they are not actively pushing it. I do have a contact in there, though, but frankly, I figured if I just rebuild the same mechanism that they already have in their UI, and warn people and constantly annoy people. So some stuff in OctoPrint is now also disabled if it is detecting an ongoing undervoltage situation, because we, for example, we saw the problem that people were installing very CPU intense plugins during, or where the plugin installation itself was CPU intense because it had to compile some stuff or something during an undervoltage situation, and then the whole installation failed or things were wonky and corrupted after that. So things like plugin installation are now simply disabled when you are experiencing an undervoltage. And that has also made this whole error situation or this whole bug report family completely go away, at the cost of some people, of course, being disgruntled. Because again, the whole with the overstay. It's funny how many people are actually angry when you tell them that what they have has a problem, because they are completely and utterly convinced that no, it hasn't, and you are wrong.
Einstein said that the universe and human stupidity are the only two things that are infinite. I would say entitlement is another one, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he also said he's not entirely sure about the universe.
Yes, yeah, of course. That's the important part of the quote, I think.
Yeah.
I was excited to hear you still get to have time to print stuff, and you get to print stuff. I'm curious what you use your 3D printers for at this point in time.
Mostly functional stuff, and actually that was all I ever did. So I got this in the first place because I wanted to be able to, when you walk around your house and you think, it would be so nice if there was some part that did this and that, so that I can just solve this one little tiny paper cut that I experience every day. So I started doing that. For example, a couple of years ago, and that's still going strong, I designed a splash guard for the kitchen sink, because every time that I was using it, it was splashing to the left over the counter, and that was annoying me. And so I just designed something with some acrylic sheet and some hinges and some printed parts that I can now pull out, and then everything to the left is protected from water splash. It's silly, but it helped me. And also the kitchen sink, the faucet was a bit stupid to handle. And so I built designed a little extension for that. It was something like 2 hours of a print, has been going strong now for 5 years, and is something that I use every day and don't even think about anymore, and has improved my life so much. And recently I bought myself an e-bike and also a trailer for it. So because I'm trying to replace my car for all these short trips that you just by yourself, and maybe carrying some groceries or something like that. So, and for that, I also bought 2 heavy duty D-locks. And then I found myself in the very weird position that I now had these locks, but no way to mount them to the bike. So I designed a mount for that. And that went over several iterations until it was finally doing what I wanted it to, but now it's working beautifully and is something that I'm very, very proud of.
There's something really satisfying about that iterative loop. It's the thing that I like about 3D printing and just computer, laser cutting, 3D printing, whatever it is you're doing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Where you build the first version, you're like, oh, this is pretty good, but it's not quite right. And then you're like, I think I can do it better. And you go back and you iterate it 3 or 4 or 5 times, and then all of a sudden you have something that's exactly what you were hoping it would be.
Yeah, and that is beautiful. And it also makes you think about the problem from various angles. Because, for example, for printing, you really have to think about, how can I print that? Because if you use something that uses FDM, you have the problem that you kind of have to fight gravity here and there. Because if you're printing something that, imagine, is shaped like a T, if you're trying to print these horizontal bars up in the end up there, and you're simply basically splurging the molten plastic out of a nozzle up there, it will just drop down. There will be nothing stopping it from falling down. So in 3D printing, you always have to think about stuff like support placement, support structure placement. Then you also have to think about, for mechanical parts, for example, for the bike lock, I explicitly modeled it on the bike lock mount. I modeled it so that all the weight would be held not by the layer adhesion, so not by the parts where the layers are stuck together, but actually by the lines that make up, so the loops that make up the individual layers, so that this would be really, really strong in the direction of force. And that, of course, then cost me a few head scratches on how to design that thing so that it was still printable without a ton of support and things like that. And I really like how this makes you... I don't get to print as much as I originally planned to when I bought the printer in the first place, because I'm more busy with the software side of things. But here and there, whenever something just annoys me or I need to solve something, then I sit down and whip up FreeCAD and design it in that and go through some iterations. And that is also something that I really, really enjoy. Also, something that I soon will have to do is I need to program a bunch of smart plugs And I need a programming jig for them so that I can easily attach the serial interface for that. And that is something where I was looking around for something that was already done to do that, but I couldn't find it. And then I found a print, but that didn't work as well. And then I figured, well, maybe I can laser cut this just from sheet stock rather easily. So I just have to sit down, cut it out, and then I have a laser cutter sitting right behind me. So, which, by the way, also runs OctoPrint.
That's a good opportunity to talk about this. OctoPrint has kind of gone from this thing that was for 3D printers to like, it seems like everything that runs or many things that run G code. Is that like, where does OctoPrint end, I guess,
in principle, OctoPrint is still the snappy web interface for your 3D printer. So it is very much still focused on 3D printers. But with the plug-in system, it's of course easy to just swap out certain parts of OctoPrint, suppress others, add others. So in case of the laser printer that I have in my office here, that is actually more like an engraver, but it is enough to cut some plywood and stuff. And that is produced by a company in Munich who had this idea for a cheap and affordable laser cutter, but lacked the software. And we met at a fair and got to talk at a trade show, I should maybe rather say. And we got to talk, and then they simply took OctoPrint and adapted it to their needs, and that worked well. So it's kind of fun that whenever I use this laser cutter, I now also use my software, even though it doesn't look even remotely like my software anymore. So yeah, kind of fun. And I also know that some people have also used it for CNC routers, and I think there is at least one pick and place project out there that uses it then for doing pick and place a population of PCBs. But yeah, in general, I mean, at its core, OctoPrint is something that can stream G code over a serial connection to something and then give you feedback about this via a WebSocket, via a web interface, or an API, whatever you want. So it can be adapted to a lot of stuff, though my focus still is on 3D printers.
So where does OctoPrint fit in the 3D printing stack for people who haven't spent time 3D printing, maybe don't understand the intricacies of the process?
Usually if you want to print something, and let's assume you already have the 3D object that you want to print, and you do not have to figure out how to design that first. So you download it from Thingiverse or from printables.com or something like that. And now you have this STL or 3MF file sitting there. And the first thing that you need to do now is what you have there is basically a mesh of triangles that make up a three-dimensional object. That is not something that the printer can do anything about or do anything with. So what you first need to do is run it through a slicer. And the slicer is basically a piece of software that takes this 3D mesh and then slices it up into individual layers based on a lot of parameters that you can configure. And then from those layers also generates the individual commands for the printer to run through. So imagine a 3D printer and an FDM 3D printer, I should add, as basically a hot glue gun mounted to a 3D gantry. So you can move it in X and Y direction, and you can also move it up into Z. And what the slicer now does is pretty much create the path that this glue gun is now supposed to take, and also include the commands at which point it is supposed to extrude how much of the glue, or in this case molten plastic, into the spot where it is currently at. And at the end, then something called a G-code file drops out. And this contains all the information, like all the layer commands and all the movement commands, and also stuff like what temperature to heat up the bed and the nozzle, and maybe also the chamber to at what point, when to start what fan, at what speeds, stuff like that. And now you need to get this somehow to the printer. And these days, the easiest way to do that is to just throw it on an SD card or on a USB stick and go to your printer and put it in, and then on the printer you select some option in the menu and tell it to print this file, and then it will do that. And that works fine. This is, however, something that 10 years ago was something that no printer could do. It also has the downside that it completely lacks a feedback loop. So the thing is, you now have your printer sitting there, maybe working for days on end, and every time that you want to figure out if it is still doing what it is supposed to be doing and how long it will still take, you have to physically go next to your printer and look at it with your own eyes. And that is annoying with really long print jobs. So where OctoPrint comes in is, instead of you throwing this piece of G-code that fell out of your slicer onto an SD card or a USB stick and then physically walking it over your printer, you instead upload it to a thing that is connected to your printer and talks to it via a serial interface. And that is OctoPrint. And then in OctoPrint's web interface, so you go into your browser, you can access that from the same PC as your slicer, for example. Go into your browser, and then you can select this file for printing and fire it off. And then you not only get progress information and temperature control, but also webcam overview. And you can even install plugins that send you notifications on your phone when it reaches certain percentages or when it's done, or it warns you about errors or stuff. With the current generation of slicers, so the most common ones, Cura, Prusa Slicer, Super Slicer, they all even have either natively built in or accessible via plugin OctoPrint integration. So instead of you having to now locate the file that your slicer produced on your disk and then uploading it through the web interface in OctoPrint, you tell your slicer, by the way, my printer is accessible via OctoPrint on this and this IP with this and this API key, and then the slicer, after slicing the file, will just send it to OctoPrint, maybe even power up the printer if needed, and do all of that for you and also show you the progress then in your slicer. So that is kind of neat.
The thing that I didn't understand when I started 3D printing is that if you hand your printer a piece of G code, it's just going to run through the steps of that G code no matter what, whether it's working or not.
Exactly. There is so we don't have a closed loop system there or something. If you run your printer through a piece of G code and at some point just hold the extruder or the print head tight in your fist, it will make some horrible grinding noises, but it will use its stepper position. And if you then let loose again, it will simply try to continue on its merry way. The problem is it will completely be offset and horrible things happen then, and it ruins the whole print. And this is because the 3D printers as we know them today, they just use run-of-the-mill NEMA 17 stepper motors. So you can tell them something like, go to this position, but you cannot say, at what position are you? Which means the firmware can only pray and hope after firing off a movement command that it will actually be executed. And with the heating, we have a bit more control, but still not much, because again, thermal runaway can be a thing and such. And it boils down to a lot of stuff can go wrong at any given point. So you really do not want to just leave it running for days and then come back to what I woke up to this morning, but way, way worse. Yeah.
I think the worst thing we ever did was make, it's amazing how much plastic it can extrude when it's spaghettifying.
Yeah.
Because you'll just get an enormous snarl of like a ball 3 feet around of plastic that's going for hours and hours and hours.
I had a bit of a problem getting all of the garbage that was generated by this mishap this morning into my garbage bin. So... And it wasn't
printers
that
are faster
much,
now.
But I mean, if you squeeze something through an 0.4, or in my case right now an 0.6 nozzle, it gets really, really thin. So even small amounts of plastic that you squeeze through such a nozzle can become very, very long. And so it always looks kind of funny. And it is a bit frustrating if it was something that you were hoping would be done by the morning, and then it is only angel hair or spaghetti or whatever. But it's okay. We live and learn.
This is the process, right?
So if resources were not a concern, if you had unlimited time, money, contributors, everything, is there what's your fantasy feature for OctoPrint? Is there like one thing you would just love to get in there if you had the capability to do so?
There's actually one thing that I've been sitting on now for years, which is rebuilding the COM layer. Because right now that communication layer, that is just like it, naturally, organically grown thing that tries to talk to every printer under the sun. And I have a refactor going on, but every time that I sit down and work on it, something happens. So the first time that I actually started working on that, the whole funding situation happened where I lost this job with the 3D printing company stuff and had to go look into the crowdfunding. So that put this on the back burner. The second time that I really had time for that, let's just say a 16-year relationship broke apart. And so that was a bit of fun. Then the next time I had the time to actually work on that, the pandemic hit. And so this thing is really under a bad star, I have the feeling. But this would be the first thing that I would tackle. Then another thing that I would immediately would look into is I'm still using JavaScript libraries and tooling from 2012. You can imagine that this is a bit of a problem these time and ages. So we are planning on, and with we I mean the regular contributors and we are planning on replacing OctoPrint's UI somewhere down the road. The challenge here is the plugin situation, because the plugins use the same UI system. So how to do this without nuking a whole ecosystem, right? And also just finding the time to sit down and finally figure out what to do, how, when, where, and why. Because, as I said, every time that I think I have time for stuff like that, something horrible happens.
I'm glad you mentioned the plugin system, because I think the plugin system is a real strength of OctoPrint. You know, the fact that you can apply machine learning to tell if the printer's gone bad from a webcam feed is like, if I told 2010 or 2011 me that was a feature of 3D printers 10 years down the road, my mind would be blown.
Yeah.
Do you have plugins that you find that feel like magic to you, or
Octolabs. So OctoPrint has this natively built-in time-lapse feature, which I originally really just added for debugging reasons and or maybe to show off a bit how a print actually works. And then Brett took this to 11 by creating Octolabs. And that was quite a funny experience, because suddenly there was this dude on the OctoPrint issue tracker who was asking for weird features to be added left and right, to pause stuff and interact with the com layer in ways that I never anticipated. But he seemed pleasant enough to work with and ask nicely. And so we worked together. And then I learned why he was asking for all of that stuff. And that was, basically developing Octolabs. And Octolabs is this time-lapse for OctoPrint on steroids, where you don't just have, I don't know, a picture taken every 2 seconds and then you see the printhead go really fast all over the screen and everything wobbles, and with a bed slinger, so a printer that moves the bed back and forth for the y-axis, you pretty much see nothing because everything just is constantly in motion. And he built this plugin that now can, at certain points, for example, on layer change or at certain points in time, just move the printhead out of the way, take a picture, then move the printhead back. And he also has modes where it looks like the printhead is just constantly going in circles over the print while it grows up from the bed. And he built all of that as an OctoPrint plugin. And the first time that I saw a time-lapse generated with Octolabs, my mind was blown, because I had no idea that this was something that was possible with OctoPrint. And that is also usually, so if you see some print job time-lapse where the print job is just growing out of the bed and the nozzle is doing fancy movements above it and everything looks just like it is synced up and stuff, that is usually Octolabs, and that has also boosted OctoPrint adoption by a ton. Single-handedly.
The initial time-lapse feature was why I installed OctoPrint at the beginning, because it made the production process for a time-lapse a lot easier. But the stuff that you can do with Octolapse is unbelievable. It's so cool.
It's amazing. He even allows you to have some G-photo integration, so you can attach a mirrorless or a DSLR or something like that to take the pictures instead of your run-of-the-mill webcam. And it's just amazing what this spits out. And then a couple of years later, he actually came up with Arc Welder. So the thing is, with most printers or most printer firmware and slicers. So slicers, usually when you have some model that is like circle shaped, it just say a cylinder. You want to print a cylinder. Your average slicer will now go there and slice this apart into individual layers. And then each circle will not be turned into a circle command for the printer, but actually segmented into individual lines. And the shorter those line segments, the faster stuff needs to be sent over the serial interface now to the printer in order to keep it fed with commands so that it doesn't start to stutter. And this is actually a problem that we see a lot with very fast prints and very curvy prints streamed over OctoPrint to firmware with very small command buffers, which is a very interesting combo. But that leads to stuttering print jobs. And maybe there's also some performance bottlenecks here and there still in OctoPrint's code that I'm trying to iron out whenever I find them. But there is a logical ceiling caused by the serial baud rate and bandwidth available, and the thing that every line has to be sent, acknowledged, and then the next sent and acknowledged, and also checksummed and whatnot. The thing is, though, that most firmware out there actually supports circle commands, or rather arc commands. So there are codes G2 and G3 to tell the printer, or rather the printhead, to move in a circle with this and this center point, and this radius from this start angle to this end angle or something like that. I think the actual coordination is a bit different, but you get the idea. So you can basically just create arcs, counterclockwise and clockwise. But the slicers do not output code that utilizes this, because not all firmware does it. And we heard there is a lot of fragmentation out there. So a slicer has the same problem in that regard, like I do with OctoPrint. I have to interface with the printers. They have to generate code that the printers can understand. So better safe than sorry and leave out the arc commands. And Brad now came and with Arc Welder created a tool that will analyze the G code and detect things that could be args and rewrite it so it contains args. And that can reduce the whole G code by 50 or 60% and obviously also increase the speed with which it can be transmitted by a lot. And that is stuff this guy just comes up with and whips out of this of his sleeve. And that is really, really astonishing.
It seems like the fragmented nature is kind of a pro and a con of the 3D printing ecosystem. Do you think, is there any movement at all to unify firmware or API for the thing that OctoPrint does?
So funnily enough, a couple of years ago, I tried that. I tried to just sit down and write a spec for G-code. And people from the CNC world will now say there is already a spec for G-code, NIST numbers, something or other. Yeah. The problem is that 3D printers use something they also call G-code, but which is in fact a file format and a serial interface protocol thingy, whereas the NIST specification for CNC machining is only a file format with a very limited command set. And when 3D printers were created in the way that we know them now, people took this CNC stuff and adapted it and hacked it together and just made it somehow work, but it grew organically and in various shapes and forms, depending on who was working on what. And a couple of years back, I decided, okay, enough is enough. This is just an absolute nightmare. I need to try to somehow generalize this, at least find a common ground, document that, and make people agree that this is how we are going to do things from now on. And herding cats would have been easier. I got together some people from the RepRap and from the 3D printing community, and it just... let's just say it devolved into name calling here and there. And that was where I decided, okay, this is not going to work that way. So my current idea is just to, as part also of the documentation effort, to just document what OctoPrint supports and then have other people just adapt to that, because anything else. At least what I achieved is that I am in the loop on some firmware developments now going on after one too many cases with, someone unintentionally broke something in a pull request, and then suddenly a whole bunch of printers didn't work with OctoPrint anymore, and I had to fill the bug reports for that. So at least that got this communication going, kind of. But yeah, let's just say there's a lot of ego in this whole community.
Fair. We've got just a couple of short questions from listeners here.
Yeah.
One is, what do you think of the evolution of AI-based failure detection and correction? Do you think that is something, A, is that in a place that it needs to be now, or is there a lot more work to do there? And B, is that something that you think will make 3D printing more accessible to people who are less technical?
I personally really enjoy what I'm seeing there. I have to admit that I so far have not used it myself. I maybe should install ObiCode later to avoid another mishap like last night once on the coming morning. But from what I can see, they have already come a long, long way. And what I think that the next step should actually be in that regard is less AI and more focus maybe on the mechanical parts, because currently we're trying to solve everything in software. And I also noticed this a lot in the feature requests for OctoPrint, where people like, oh, OctoPrint should tell me if the print bed is not clear, or OctoPrint should do this and that and work around firmware limitations and some such. And I think not everything should be, or we should, as a community, we should not try to beat every problem into submission with software, because sometimes the easier and also the cleaner solution really is to solve it in hardware. And for things like, for example, layer skipping, where at some point the print head got stuck somewhere, for example, on the print object itself, and now you have an offset on every consecutive layer due to that. Things like this could be really easily solved with a closed loop system on the steppers, where we would actually know where they are at a given moment, and not where we hopefully send them to, but where they actually are. And these are solved problems. It's just expensive technology, or not that expensive, but way more expensive than 150 euros at the hardware store that we are currently, or that a lot of people are currently willing to pay for a printer. And yeah, I think that would be one big step to take. Of course, 3D printing for masses is always something where I'm a bit unsure whether that is the right approach, because a 3D printer is still something very technical, and I'm not sure that we want to dump them down enough that they can be something that everyone can easily operate, because at that point, usually they either become proprietary, which we do not want, because we've been there, and the result were printers that cost millions, or they become limited. And we probably also do not want to do that because then we will have less than we have now. So personally, I think a 3D printer is a tool, like a CNC machine is, like, I don't know, like a power drill is, like a saw is, like my laser cutter is. And for a tool, you need to learn some stuff first. It is not something that you simply put into your bedroom and then have your toddler use or something like that. But it is a tool. It is a machining tool. It is a very approachable one, in my opinion, compared to all the other stuff. Also because the most that it produces is fumes and noise and not a lot of chips and stuff flying around and no powder. Good, of course, if you're working with resin printers, this situation is a bit different because then you have a lot of very, very toxic chemicals that you're now suddenly handling. But the FDM printer side is very, very easy and approachable, I think, but it is still a tool. And I don't think that our expectation should be that this should turn from a tool to something like a paper printer, because it is a very, very more complex process, and it will always be a more complex process.
What's the most interesting place you've found people using OctoPrint, or you've heard of people using OctoPrint? Are there any notable ones?
I mean, what I really love is whenever I hear about someone using them in a classroom for the curriculum, where the students actually design stuff, learn how to shape things in a CAD program. Maybe do something like first they go through how is a function formed, and then rotate that around some axes, and then extrude that or export that into a CAD program, and then slice that and send that off to a printer, and suddenly you have a figurine that is based on a mathematical formula that you entered into something. And things like this is where I think it really helps kids and young adults to learn that they are in control of the world around them, and that they can do more than just consume and take whatever is already created, but that they can actually shape the world around them. And I've also had the pleasure of, when I was still at my old job, but already doing OctoPrint on the side, at some point we organized a little maker get together in the company, and I dragged my 3D printer in there and showed it off and fired it off and printed some whistles where the P inside the whistle was already inside the whistle. So I had to break it off afterwards, but it was inside, printed inside. And there were 3 kids there of a colleague who were absolutely blown away. I gave each of them a whistle. I'm not sure if the colleague would still talk to me after that, but but the glowing in their eyes, that was just absolutely amazing. Like they understood what was happening there, and they understood the process. And I think it might have shifted something in their heads as to how to approach the world, even a tiny, tiny bit. I know that it did for me when I got access to a 3D printer, how it started making me not look at a problem and go, but rather, maybe if I just do this and then design something like that and then add some screws here and hey, solved.
It has the same loop as like the first time you use an Arduino to do something, and you instead of changing something on a screen with code, you turn on a light or turn on a motor with code. It has the same.
Absolutely.
It gives you the same good brain.
Absolutely. And I guess that's also why I maybe also am drawn to electronics, which is also something that I tinker with. So it all just tickles the same part of my brain. I think this problem solving and then being able to build something custom to your specific problem, but maybe not so custom that it cannot also be used by others. So that is also something that I find very rewarding, and like just solving an issue not only for me, but also for others, and reducing the time that collective humankind has to spend on problems, maybe.
I love it. I can't think of a better way to spend your time.
Right? It is fun.
So one of the things we're really interested in on the show is kind of the lifestyle of making your living from an open source project. You're full-time on OctoPrint, and you're pretty much just crowdfunding
exactly
the project at this point. Is that the model?
Yeah, exactly. So I have a Patreon, I have GitHub sponsors, I have some ad revenue from the forums and the main webpage and the plugin repository as well. I have some merchandise going on as well, but that's not really generating much revenue. That's more like people were asking for it. And so I figured, well, okay, here is a Spreadshirt store, have fun. And all of that combined is actually paying my salary, so to speak. And that is pretty amazing. I am still kind of stumped that this works. And I actually am also a bit skeptical if it will work endlessly, but currently it looks good. And I'm just going with it and happy that it is working, because it has enabled me to work full-time on OctoPrint and really concentrate fully on it. And even better than the employment situation that I had before, because there I also had a bit, of course, the employer had some interest in OctoPrint, steering it in certain directions. And while I was still fully in control, of course, I had to always juggle a bit with regards to what to spend my time on and so. And now I simply concentrate on the things that I think will bring the most value to the community in one way or the other. So currently, for example, the biggest next task is actually something that only on second look will bring value to the community. Because the thing is that, this year so far has been very, very intense for some reason. I think so the pandemic brought in a ton of more users because everyone was buying printers to print PPE and then keeping the printers and continuing to print stuff. So the last, let's say, 3 years have been even more stressful and even more work intense as before. And it's now come to a point where I'm noticing that the project as it is needs to change in that way that I need to make it sustainable for me again, and for reasons of my own mental health. So the current idea is, or the current push is towards better documentation, better contributor help. Because the thing is that even 10 years in, or almost 10 years in, most of the code is still only written by me. So recently, over the last couple of releases, that has gotten a bit better, and I'm actually seeing a lot of pull requests now that I then have to take care of and such, but it's still mostly a one-woman show, and that only scales so much. So the goal now is to really try to open this up more, make it more accessible, get a ton of that stuff that currently only lives in my head about knowledge of the system, knowledge about the G-code communication stack, knowledge about various firmware quirks and stuff, all of this somehow documented. And this is like a behemoth of work, but I think it will be worth it. Even though at first, I think the regular user of OctoPrint will probably not immediately see that as a benefit, but long term, I think it definitely will be a benefit for the project as a whole.
It seems like this is a turn that most successful projects hit at some point, where they go from either one or a small number of contributors to realizing that they need to be building the infrastructure so that a lot more people can contribute. Do you have the sense that there are like people waiting, eager, ready to go and start contributing code, making pull requests?
I talk very openly about situations like these. Also, I have this monthly or semi-monthly devlog for OctoPrint for my Patreons mostly, but I also push the recordings public for everyone after, where I also talk about things like that. And whenever I mention that I'm just feeling overwhelmed and that I need to look into somehow making all of this a bit more sustainable again, I always get people like, how can I help? How can I help? So the will is there. The problem is that right now the project is simply not in a state where I can just point someone somewhere and say, go, because that will only generate even more work, because then I have to teach them first. So the idea is to get the teaching out up front and then hopefully scale it that way. And in some way, I actually already did this when I created the plugin system back in 2015, because before that, whenever someone wanted a new feature in OctoPrint, they had to request it from me to build, and maybe they also build it themselves, but then after I had to maintain it myself. And with the plugin system, I now have this situation that when someone wants something that is not suitable for the general public or not usable for the general public, because, for example, it targets a very specific piece of hardware, that additional hardware lights that are attached to the Raspberry Pi, or a very specific notification service or something like that. That is not something that should go into core, but now I can tell people, hey, just build it as a plugin, and then people can install it and use it. And that way I already have at least this maintenance overload spread over, I think something like 300... No, it's not 300 plugin authors, but something like 300 plugins. I have to look that up, but over a massive amount of shoulders. And the good thing is that people who write plugins and write many plugins and are really into writing plugins sooner rather than later also learn about the internals of OctoPrint, and then also help here and there. And this is how I currently recruit contributors. And that has been very fruitful. But it would be really nice, I think, to make it even easier to get a grasp of how stuff works, because it's still something where if you are interested into getting into OctoPrint development right now, you will have to do a lot of legwork because you will have to sit down and read through the code. I mean, I do my best in documenting it well and making it so that you can really read it and understand it, but you still will need some while to navigate the code base, to figure out which components live where, what part talks to what, and stuff like this. And these are things that are currently absolutely, living inside my head and ready to be called there even after 4 weeks of vacation, as I'm just noticing. But it's something that not everyone obviously has, and it would be nice to just have some kind of documentation also documenting the code structures, documenting the whole architecture, also design decisions, because often I get things where someone implements something, but in a way that will cause issues because they have not thought about this, and that, and things like that, I think are way less likely to happen if you have more of a larger overview about how everything fits together and clicks together.
Is your end goal to get to the point that you can say, hey, here's a list of tasks that need to be done and people can just grab them and do pull requests?
That
and
would
get
be
there?
wonderful. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
More people writing code means it's better for everybody, right?
I mean, it's not only writing code. It would also be nice having help in writing documentation, improving documentation and such. But for that, you also have to first, of course, get an entryway into the platform and all that. And that is something where I found the project to be severely lacking at the moment, because it's just, I mean, you find a lot of very beginner-friendly things, like how do you install OctoPrint, how do you install plugins into it and things. I also have a plugin tutorial which covers the basics on how to get up running and also points you to various spaces where you can go to try more. And then, of course, there's also a whole bunch of plugins that you can just look at and figure out how they did certain things. But that will only get you so far. And I have a certain quality expectation when it comes to the code of OctoPrint. In order to be able to, in order to enable contributors to meet that, I think I have to do some more legwork in order to give them the information and the background that they need to know what is what and why things should be done in a certain way and not others. And yeah.
Well, then there's infrastructure and stuff like code reviews and all. Like there's a ton that goes into the post work once people do the contributions as well, which I think a lot of people who use open source projects maybe don't exactly understand.
Yeah, that pull requests are always a bit of a mixed bag in that regard. So thankfully, often it's a case of you look at the code and it looks fine and you just merge it and say thank you and hooray, another bug solved and another small improvement made, everything is fine. But often it's also a case, for example, yesterday I found myself in the situation, or was it the day before yesterday, it's all a blur, where I was reviewing a pull request that someone had sent and I was really struggling to describe the downside of the current design and why another design would be better. And it took me something like an hour or so to somehow put my thoughts on paper, so to speak, and communicate it to them. And I'm still not sure if I did this correctly because I haven't heard back yet. But it would have taken me 5 minutes to do it myself. But these 5 minutes, I mean, if I always take these 5 minutes and do it myself, that doesn't educate anyone. That doesn't teach the others how to do this properly. So taking this time to teach and to explain and to motivate and maybe also to just walk them through my own thoughts and my approach to solution discovery and all that pays off, but it costs a lot of time. So what I never understand is really how projects like, for example, Home Assistant that get swamped in pull requests, how they do that, because all of this stuff has to be reviewed, all of this stuff has to be coached, and I'm certainly not at a point yet where I would be able to handle that amount of pull requests, for example. As wonderful as it is to get these many community contributions, they always also cost time to handle, and that is something that I think would be lovely if more people also understood, that if their pull request sits around a while, that doesn't mean I'm not interested in it or that I don't like it and I'm simply too chicken to tell them, but it might just be a simple resource problem.
When we had Paulus on the show, I think he said they have 16 people who are working in different aspects of Home Assistant. So
we are in contact as well.
Yeah.
If you have amount of people that I now also have some people who help me with reviewing and stuff, but still due to the lack of knowledge transfer from the past, I still am stuck on a lot of stuff that I have to do myself.
So you're based in Germany, and a good number of the maintainers and open source developers that we've talked to are based in various parts of Europe. Do you feel like Europe is maybe a better and more supportive environment for people to do open source work full time?
Maybe full time because we have this healthcare thing that is better implemented.
That's what I was hoping you would say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that our approach to healthcare is perfect. In fact, I could rant probably for another hour or so about everything that is wrong with the German approach to healthcare. But at least I do not have to worry about developing a toothache or breaking my hand or something. I mean, I still would worry about breaking my hand, but I wouldn't worry about the invoice from the hospital or something like that, but rather about when will I be able to work again? Can I ever go climbing again or something like that? So I think that might be a factor. But I don't know. I also see a lot of, at least from the plugin maintainers, a bunch of them are from the US. But as you said, none of them full time. So yeah, maybe that is indeed a thing.
It also seemed like, at least in the past, maybe like in primary schools and early education, you all did a better job teaching kids how to program, it seems like, than we did here. I know you were self-taught, but
I wouldn't say that about my school, I have to say.
Okay. It's mostly the Norwegians, I think, that have.
Yeah, I mean, the Scandinavian side of things is regarding education. The education system is top notch, so that is pretty damn amazing what they are doing there.
Thanks again to Gina for coming by and chatting with us. This has been fascinating. I've been using OctoPrint since almost the beginning. We used it on some of the early MakerBots that we used at the tested office for the Print the Mystery object. We did a series of videos where we printed a new object every week-ish for 5 years, I think, 4.5 years. And it was literally the reason I gave to the people in charge of money. I was like, hey, we need to buy a 3D printer. They were like, well, if you're only getting one video out of it, I'm not spending $1,000. And I was like, what if we did a video every week with it? And they were like, yes, that's what we're looking for.
No, that's ROI.
Yeah, and then it ended up being an enormous boondoggle that took hours and hours and hours every week for a 4-minute video that like 50,000 people watched. So,
well, hey, I got that little headphone hook out of it from you, so totally worth it.
Oh, that's true. I printed you a headphone hook, right?
Yes, and a tiny Super Meat Boy.
Yeah, I printed a tiny Joey Famelli, our producer.
That's amazing.
It sat on our dining room table for a really long time. But if you'd like to know more about OctoPrint, you can find out more at octoprint.org. It runs on a bunch of Pis. I've run it on, Gina said not to run it on low end, on old Pis now, but like a Pi 3 will run it fantastic, is my understanding. And when I get a new 3D printer, I'm going to plug it back up. And I've kind of got the hankering for 3D printer as a result of talking to Gina about this.
Yeah, I can see it. Also, listen to Gina. Don't use a substandard power supply with your Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, never.
Just don't.
Never. It was also fascinating to talk to somebody who's at this stage of their open source journey, where she's now into the place where she's doing the work to expand the audience for contributors to the project. I want to say, I'm thinking back, I think she's the first maintainer we've heard essentially say that they're still writing basically all the code themselves. Yeah, we everybody else we've talked to has like gone through this trial. Like it almost, from talking to different people over the last 6 months since we started doing the show, it seems like everybody reaches a point where they're like, okay, I have to do some work so that other people can do the work and help me do the work. And like Paulus at Home Assistant did this long ago. With Gina, it seems like she's just reaching that point, and I'm excited to see how it goes for her, and I'm sure she would love contributors soon. So I guess that'll do it for us this week. This episode of the FOSS Pod, as always, is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. Matt Purdy produced this episode, and Sabrina Hill edited it. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of the FOSS Pod. I don't know about you, Brad, but I'm feeling a little samba in my life.
Samba? Really? Hang on.
Samba!
People can't see you dancing in this video call.
Oh, this is awkward.
Yeah, dude, I've been spending a lot of time in smb.conf recently, so the next episode, well-timed for me.
See y'all then. Well, that was a fabulous interview. What lovely and intelligent people. Too much?
If we do say so ourselves.
Yes. Oh. I thought you did an excellent job, Brad.
Well, thank you. Same to you. We're just the best.
We really do kick ass. Modest. I realized that as I was looking at the FOSSPod page for the first time in a while, I realized that the joke description of the show that I typed in and never changed is still there.
Oh,
which is from the creative geniuses behind Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod.
That was an extremely considered tongue-in-cheek kind of thing.
Yeah, last minute. I hope people get that joke, because otherwise we just sound like incredible assholes.
They have to, right?
I would hope so. But
nobody would say that earnestly, right?
Oh, no, that is, people absolutely would say that earnestly. I would hope not about a podcast. But anyway, it's speaking of people who aren't incredible assholes and are actually really delightful, wonderful people. This is the part of the show where we thank our patrons.
Thank you, patrons.
Thank you, patrons. As always, if you would like to find out how you can support Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod, you can leave an iTunes review, but even better, you can go to patreon.com/techpod and mash that subscribe button. For as little as $2 a month, you can get access to the fabulous Tech Pod Discord, where there's a bunch of beautiful nerds who talk about things that are almost certainly going to be of interest to you if you've made it this far into this podcast, including 3D printing and Linux and running things on Raspberry Pis. And
I missed a conversation in the Linux channel today about shell customization, people sharing their aliases.
Look, I'm going to tell you a secret about being the person who's one of the two people whose name is on the podcast, is that when you go into the channel and you dredge up a 4-hour-old conversation,
I know. Yeah.
No one's going to complain.
I know.
With great power, great responsibility, yada, yada. This is the part of the show where we thank our patrons. So as always, a very special thank you goes out to our executive producer tier patrons, including Paddle Creek Games, makers of Fractured Veil, Andrew Slosky, Do the Bunny Crime, Serve the Bunny Time. This is getting a little intense now.
Lyrical.
Wedge, Joel Krauska, Twinkle Twinkie, and James Kamek. Thank you all so much. We appreciate you all.
Yes, we do.
And I guess that will do it for us this week. I hope everybody has a lovely, lovely, lovely week. And we will be back next week with another fresh episode of Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod. See you all next week.